just hello and welcome to Bulimia Sucks. Now, I'm your host, Kate Hudson Hall, and thank you to everybody for listening. Now, this is a platform for people to share relatable and uplifting, but also inspiring conversations based on bulimia, anorexia, and other eating disorders. And if you don't know, in the episodes, we talk with people who are struggling now with an eating disorder, and they share their personal stories and their difficult journeys and maybe their steps taken into their recovery and how they've done that. And also to people who have overcome an eating disorder, and then to professionals who maybe haven't or have had an eating disorder and how they help their clients with the challenges that come up. Now, I have written a book, and it is to help people with anxiety. So I'm very excited about my book because it's with the formatters at the moment, and hopefully it will be released in August or September. And the book is called Anxiety Hacks, and the subtitle is Techniques, Tools and Tips to Calmness. So I teach the techniques and tools and a variety of tips that I have taught to thousands of my clients over the years. So taking you from being constantly riddled with explosive anxiety to giving you the tools to be able to loosen that grip on the anxiety and to feel calmer, which is what we all need, particularly right now. So our fabulous guest today, let me tell you all about her. So her name is Kyira Wackett, and she is a licensed mental health therapist and entrepreneur. She is the owner of Adversity Rising, where she equips people with the confidence and skills to write their own story. She also sees patients in a private therapy practice treating eating disorders, anxiety disorders, and trauma. Her specialities lie in communication, boundary settings, and distress tolerance, forgiveness for self and for others, and cognitive frame and empowerment. Kyira is a trauma survivor as well as lives in recovery from an eating disorder and generalized anxiety. She believes that all of us have the capacity to author our own stories and relinquish the holds of shame, fear, and anxiety with the right support and skills. So welcome, Kyira. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so pleased you're here. So let's begin now. Do you have a funny story, Kyira?
Well, no, we were talking a little bit about this offline, and I went back and forth on, do I want to tell one of the funny stories with my toddler? Because life with the toddler, I feel like it's filled with joy and pain and everything in between, or childhood. But I think because of just the hilariousness and the fact that we're still dealing with it, we'll go with the toddler story. And yes. So unfortunately, we had this situation yesterday where my kid and I were going to go to this art class, and we've been recently, we were talking in offline of, she was born right before the pandemic. And so mom is, learning how to deal with her anxiety, bringing this human out into the world where we know that COVID
after
is still,
2 years or so.
Yeah.
Gosh,
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And what do we do? And is it safe? And how do we do it? And so then we get these plans. And of course, anybody that has anxiety or sort of a perfection component is like, it's supposed to go a certain way. It needs to go this way. What's going to happen? And we get there, and it's supposed to be this toddler time class. Everything is set up. There's a teacher that does a whole kind of thing. And we get there, no one's there. And I walk in, and there's like a summer camp or something for, it looked like high schoolers, maybe middle schoolers. And they're all kind of looking at us like, who are these people that walked in? And it turns out that not like we weren't apparently supposed to be there, because this person had canceled this class, never said anything to us. They weren't there. And immediately I'm just pissed because we drove 20 minutes. It's like a lot to get my kid in the car. I just want to play in the parks and go do everything else. So getting her psyched to go do something. And then when it doesn't turn out, you feel like you've failed. And from a shame perspective, of course, I made that all about me in a matter of like 6 seconds. I was like, how did I screw this up? And so
Oh, that
we're,
perfectionism.
oh God, yeah. Yeah. And it just hits you in a brief matter of seconds. And so I'm like, who can I reach out to? I want a refund. And I tried to be very diplomatic in my approach. The person that was there, that wasn't their fault. Like, I try to use that thought of nobody's trying to make my day harder. My day was made harder, and I get to validate that. And they weren't setting out to make my day harder. But in the moment, it's really hard to call upon all those skills. And so I'm in the car and I'm telling her that we're gonna, go do our own art. And I said, mommy's gonna bring out her computer for a second, because I try really hard never to be on technology when we're spending time together, unless it's a really important reason. I said, I just want to send an email so that I can put this out of my brain and let them know, hey, this happened, just in case there were any other families that weren't told, something happened, whatever. I said, can mommy do that for about 5 minutes and we'll do some art together. And as I'm writing this email, I could feel myself getting hot. I started talking out loud, apparently. And my daughter Everly's listening to me, and I'm just, mad and all this. And I guess the backstory, I probably talk about emotions with my kid like 10 to 12 times a day. Like, I joke when she gets older, she's not going to want to do anything that is, quote unquote, wrong, because she's not going to want to process the emotion with her mom afterward. Like, that is going to be her guiding light to like never want to do anything hurtful or harmful in the world. So I'm just sitting there, I'm like, well, this is not fair. And this is that. And she comes over to me and she puts her hand on my leg and she goes, Mama, life's not fair sometimes, is it? And it was like the most endearing, and yet the funniest sort of like, your kid takes everything you're teaching them and slapping it back in your face. And you just look at it and you go, oh shit. Yeah. Yep. And I just burst out laughing. And I was like, baby, you are so like, it's a $15 class. Like, I have given the last 45 minutes, if not an hour, to this person. Like, I am fuming. I am talking about how unfair it is and all this. Like, at the end of the day, if we lost the $15, we are privileged and fortunate enough that we would have been okay. Or if I had waited till tomorrow, like, I could have just been there with her. But just the fact that she just sort of paused and put it out there. And there was this like reality moment of, our kids are always paying attention and they're watching way more than we think they are. Yeah. And how wonderful, because her brain is meant to be in the present. Her brain only knows that, to just like pull me back into the present and be like, yeah, that is true, isn't it, mommy? And then like, runs right away afterwards and tells me that she wants to go back to the park and go down slides. Like, she doesn't stay there with me, but it was just, like, oh, mama, let's go to the park.
Mama, she needs grounding.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just find it, it's humorous. It's joyous. It's like enlightening. It's also one of those moments where you realize, I do this professionally. I have a significant number of skills. I still have my own therapist. I do the work every day. And yet when you're not careful, it catches us. And anxiety, eating disorders, shame, it pulls us down sometimes quicker than we realize.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll just tell you briefly something that my granddaughter said to me a couple of weeks ago. So I have a big birthday coming up, and she's very excited about it. She's got a little costume to wear, and it's all very exciting. And anyway, she said to me, she calls me Kiki. And she went, oh, Kiki, Kiki. And I said, oh, yes, yes. And she said, do you know what? And I said, what? She said, you're going to be really old. I was like, oh, well, I suppose that's true, isn't it?
Yeah. Which to her you are, because
absolutely. She's only 6, so
yeah. So to her, like 6 is old, So then thinking about like a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old, or like you do the math in their mind. They're like, whoa, this is I used to have that even with the kids that I taught volleyball to, where they're teenagers, and they'd be like, how old are you? And I'd be like, well, guess. And I was maybe 25 at the time, like 40, 50. And I'm like, because to you, it's all relative. Like, you have no idea. I'm just old to you because I'm not in middle school anymore, and so it's
I'm
so
like
much
a dinosaur to her.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so Kyira, so let's begin. So tell us about your experience with your eating disorder.
Yeah, I think so. I grew up in a lot of trauma, addiction, mental health runs in my family pretty deep. I'm an only child to a single mom who unfortunately did not have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder or real kind of active support around her substance use issues until I was much, much older. And so she had gotten sober when she got pregnant with me. She wasn't supposed to be able to have kids. So when she got pregnant with me, there was some sort of switch in her brain. It was this incredible protective factor. So she stopped using any substances. She kind of shifted her life quite a bit. I think it was almost like a one-time really big hit of a mental health sort of reset for her. We also know obviously bipolar and other disorders kind of up and down throughout life. But so I spent the first 10 years with her. I think there's a lot I'm learning about life that wasn't maybe healthy always, but it felt solid in the ways that I knew what solid and normal was. I mean, we moved like 12 times before I was 10 years old. I think there were a lot of signs of maybe bipolar still showing up, but I felt loved, I felt seen, I felt heard, I felt safe. I had these kind of key things. And then unfortunately, my mom relapsed when I was 10 or 11, but it got pretty significantly bad when I was 11 going on 12. And I had to move out and move in with family. And I was kind of shuffled around to different homes. I ended up living with my grandma, who became kind of a secondary mom for me, where I spent the majority of later middle school, high school, and kind of early adulthood. And I would say around that time, I wouldn't have known at 12 or at 13 or at 14 to call it impacts of trauma, but I started to have, I think, obviously trauma responses. There are a lot of details of the story that obviously we don't have time to get into today, but my brain shifted, my wiring. I was sort of in a state of hypervigilance all the time, and my body was responding. And I remember in middle school, there was constantly this feeling in my family when I lived with my aunt and uncle of kind of being, like, there was even a joke at one point, they used to call me Cinderella. And it was kind of this like, you're here, but you're not really a part of the family. And I think they meant it to be funny. It obviously isn't. But there were these moments where they'd comment about my body or about my weight, or I didn't get new clothes to fit my body as my body had changed. So I was wearing clothes that were pretty tight. So I remember being aware of my body and then being aware that my friends' bodies looked different. And when I was in high school, I would say I was the biggest of my friends. We all were on volleyball teams together. They would work out in spandex shorts and a sports bra. And I remember being like, their bodies look like they can do that. The inputs, the messages that we get about, well, these bodies are allowed to wear these things. My body is not. My body looks different. I also kind of remember now, I mean, I knew they were doing it, but a lot of them were engaging in very disordered eating behaviors, if not full-fledged eating disorders at the time. And at that point, it was just a lot of body shame. It was, I want my body to look different. I started weighing myself a lot, but I didn't change anything. It was there. It was an anxiety, but it was one of so many anxieties, of like, well, is my mom going to end up in prison? Is my mom coming back? Am I going to do this? Like, am I going to get kicked out of a house again? What do I need to do for grades? Sort of the perfectionism drove up. So it was there, but it hadn't kind of taken a front seat. And then in college, I remember I was still very much like, my body isn't beautiful. Like, I remember that being a very clear thought that I had, like, my body is bigger than the people around me. And that in my brain was a messaging I got that therefore my body is not beautiful. And growing up in the US, having the messages again of like a thin, white, cisgender female body is the ideal, that looks a very specific way. And so in college, that was right around the time that some changes were being made where nutrition information was being shown everywhere. So it was happening in our college, whatever, I forget what they're called, like the cafeterias, but I forget what they're called. And I started noticing things. I started kind of shifting what I ate a little bit. I was, in high school hanging out with my mostly guy friends, and we'd eat Wendy's, McDonald's, a lot of that kind of stuff all the time. I started eating different. And I think it was maybe just more balance, but I started dropping weight. And suddenly, I think what happened is, as my body changed, I got these external reinforcements that the change was noticed in a positive way, mixed with the shame I had been carrying about feeling like I wasn't good enough for grades, body, I didn't have parents, I didn't have these things, like all these things. It was like the perfect storm for the eating disorder to come in full force. And so I didn't go like, gosh, I need to start doing more of this to lose weight. I need this. I mean, we see this with so many stories. It became sort of a tempering of anxiety by having something that started to feel like it was pivoting away, where I didn't feel so less than, and I didn't feel so behind. And of course, obviously there's the oversimplification that's just about control, but I think there is the piece of, it felt like a little bit less of this sort of desperate hopelessness as I started to see that people were treating me in a way that felt, good. I'm suddenly accepted. I'm suddenly this. And And of course, then that started the domino of what the next 7 or 8 years of my life looked like in the eating disorder.
Right. And then what made you sort of decide that you were going to reach out for help?
Because I got bird flu or swine flu, not bird flu, swine flu. So I was in college. And again, a lot of the people I spent time with, one of my roommates had a really severe eating disorder, and I was trying to help her, and I was trying to be the support. And that was kind of my life. I was a very parentified child. I was the person that could handle a lot. So I was always holding these stories for other people. But again, I think my shame brain was like banking this information for later. So then as soon as I started to engage in behaviors, I had like all this arsenal of tools sort of ready to go. So I knew that, how she would make herself throw up. I knew how she would cut calories. I knew these different things. Well, I started doing it more and more and more. And I joke that I think from 2008 to 2010, I like single-handedly put the Post-it note company like in business, because I would go through so many Post-it notes every day of writing down what I ate, when I could eat again, what that looked like. Well, I started to have some pretty severe just physical effects, as anybody would when they're not getting enough fuel for their body every day. And then it was I forget what year it was that the swine flu came to the US. I mean, it was around the whole globe, and I got it. And it started to affect me really, really bad. I was having like my oxygen levels were really low. I had a lot of the numbers, when you go in and they're doing different tests and measurements, and then obviously my weight dropping and things like that. There was something really severely wrong. I ended up in the hospital, and I ended up having to see heart specialists and all of these pieces. And it was enough to go, this is the thing. And I think that was the part that made me say I might have a disorder. Because I remember I'd go into my doctor and be like, I'm worried about this, and try to talk to me about it. And I'd be like, F you, I can go eat whatever I want. And I'd of course go and eat, and it would end up being a binge, and then I'd throw up, and then the cycle would continue. But honestly, it wasn't until like, I think I held maybe this is a thing, maybe it's an issue. And then it continued and it continued. And I met my now husband at the time. I was 21. It was bad, still bad. I got sick again with another pretty severe disorder when I was diagnosis when I was traveling. But I started to become aware of how much it was affecting me. And the night that I decided I couldn't do it anymore, we had gone out to dinner. We ate at this restaurant. It was such a nice time. And I spent the whole night in my head thinking about how many calories we were eating, thinking about, how much weight I was going to gain. I hated exercise at the time. So compensation was very specifically around how can I get rid of it as quickly as possible through whatever means that was. And I went home, and I never threw up when he was home. I never engaged in behaviors when he was home, and I threw up. And he opened the door to check in on me, and like my hand was in my throat. And so he saw this. And I think it was the coming together of the performance self with the real self. And the pain he had on his face for me was enough to be like, shit, I'm losing my life in this disorder. And I think that was really the moment I was like, I don't think I want to have this, because it was all hooked to the body, right? If I don't do this, my body's going to get fat. I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to be gross. I mean, all the words that your eating disorder tells you. It's like, I don't think I want this enough to feel what I'm feeling right now. And I think that was the shift from, oh, this might be a thing, to I'm going to die or I'm going to lose myself.
So to bring it into the consciousness. Yeah.
Exactly. The turning and facing, I think. And that's when it really happened. And then, a few years of treatment. And obviously I talk about them. I don't think anybody's ever in full recovery. I think it's an active process every single day to continue to stay in the forefront of knowing what could happen, being intentional, doing the work, all that kind of stuff.
Right. And what did you find was the most helpful? So you obviously had a therapist, you had, I don't know, what other help you had? Psychiatrist, did you?
Honestly, and this is the part that I hate, because I love therapy, and I specialize in eating disorders. I've worked at the hospitalization level, the PHP level, the outpatient level. I think it can be incredible. I was not fortunate enough to find therapists that were skilled to do the work, but thought they were. And so that was really hard, because when I did decide to get help, I didn't know how to find a therapist. I didn't know how you did it. I was like, I don't know, you just pick from a list. And then when I'd ask, the insurance company, or I'd call a clinic, and be like, I have this thing I need to talk to somebody about. So it's a lot of, I mean, I remember one person telling me in an intake that they thought I'd had oral surgery on like a mucus gland when I was 10. And they thought, well, that created an oral fixation, which led to this eating disorder. Or, you know, somebody that basically, like all these little things. I'm like, can we talk about my trauma? Can we talk about my body hate? Can we talk like all these things? And so I didn't actually feel like I got help from a therapist until like the person that really shifted it was she's a nurse practitioner, but she was acting kind of in that role of like my primary care provider. And she was the first person to just ask real questions and sit with me and have conversations. And I remember things like, I was scared to travel with Jordan. We were actually coming out to visit the Pacific Northwest, and I was scared because I was like, this is going to be 2 weeks where I can't control what I'm eating. I can't do this. Like, what if I gain weight? You know, I was weighing myself all the time. I was engaging in a lot of, at the time, it was still an eating disorder, not otherwise specified diagnosis, because I was
Right.
kind of going back and forth between the anorexia and bulimia. But it was, you know, she was like, then you call me and you message me and we talk about it and we help show your brain that you're going to be okay. And that was really the person that gave me the belief of this could happen, but she also validated the intensity of it. And things like, she was the first person to tell me, like, I wanted to talk about my trauma, but I didn't know I had trauma. Now I can name it that way. I can talk freely about it. But like, she was the first person to say, your eating disorder is not the problem. The problem is the trauma. The problem is the shame, the anxiety. Your eating disorder is your body's way of, it found a coping skill that works in some capacity.
Yes.
Like, you are not screwed up because of that. And I think somebody just being able to see that, I've been fortunate now to find therapists and psychiatrists and other people that know a lot of what they're doing. And now being in the field, I'm just blessed with even consultation groups and people, you know, there's groups for therapists who've had eating disorders so that we can make sure we're staying in recovery. So we're best supporting patients. But yeah, honestly, unfortunately, it was a really sad thing of the field I'm in. I didn't have that experience, which made it really hard to want to keep doing the work when you feel like you're not getting anywhere right away.
Yeah. Yeah. So Kyira, what would you say to somebody, what would you suggest to them if they decided that they wanted to reach out for help and they were looking at a list of therapists? What would you say?
Yeah. And I can send you a link to this and we could put it in the show notes too. I just did a video because this comes up so much of how do you find the right therapist for you? And so I made a video and some of the questions to ask, considerations to have, and a handout that goes with it so that people can use it. I mean, I think the biggest thing when we're talking about eating disorders is having somebody that specializes in it and that has a framework that aligns with your values. Because I've worked with clinicians and docs that believe it's entirely genetic and only view it as this way, and that treatment looks a very specific way, and there's a very strong rigidity around the food and the structure and what that means. And then I've had people that are much more in the mindset of all foods fit. How do we introduce these things? How do we create flexibility? This is cultural. And there are people that fall on both ends and everywhere in between. So I think just knowing to ask for somebody that has a specialization, and depending on where people live in the US, you can have actual credentialing that you go through to get, you know, to show that you're specialized in eating disorders. You can ask people about this, and you can do, and I think a lot of people aren't aware, you can have a consult before you see your provider. And so I think we have such a tendency, especially, and I know this is happening around the world, but in the US, that's not really all I can speak of personally. But I mean, our wait list at one point, we had to shut it down because it was over 175 people long. So the hard part is then you get on a wait list and you just get anybody. So you take anybody. So then you meet them for the first time and you're like, they're not great, but like, I don't want to wait another 6 months. So I'll just stick with it. And the catch 22 is recognizing for some people that's necessary to have just a pair of hands that are like looking at a chart, that are checking something out, or even just seeing their doctor. Sometimes that can do more harm than good. And so I think that's the tricky part with eating disorders, is that medical stability piece really dictates how quickly we need care. But from the therapy side specifically, I think if you're not matching up with your therapist, you're not going to be honest, you're not going to do the work, you're not going
to open up, are you?
No, exactly. And you're going to find ways to talk through whatever you need to say to continue to make it okay, because they're not going to know how to challenge it, because it's not their skill set. That's not how they view things. And so I think knowing you have to see yourself as being deserving of somebody to call you out on stuff, even if you hate the fact that they're going to do it. And so that being, I think, a key thing of getting clear up front what you're looking for and how to ask for that without believing what your eating disorder and your shame's been telling you your whole life of like, take what you can get because you're lucky you even get that.
Yeah. So you said you just made up a recording.
Yes. Yeah. So I did a video on how to find the right therapist for you. So I'll send that to you so you can put it in the show notes. And there's a handout that I made to go with it. So people can fill it in and make it their own and kind of use it almost as like their interview paperwork,
Good.
kind of their questionnaire. Yeah. So I'll
That's
send it to you.
great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so Kyra, so if somebody is thinking about reaching out for help, taking that first step onto the recovery path, so what would you suggest to them to sort of guide them forward with that?
Meaning like in terms of who to start with or where to start, or
To make that decision?
I mean, I think the thing that helps the most is the gap to making a call to get help is typically that we're trying to convince ourselves we don't have a problem because of what it would mean if we did. And so a lot of the times, again, I can only really speak to having lived in the US, but I know this happens across the world where it's been conditioned in us where it's such a hustle culture. Everybody's got to be fine. Everybody's got to be good. You got to be chasing to that next step of perfection. And even the way we talk about it, we talk about being ill. We talk about this like sort of problem saturated person of like, well, you're just not good enough. And I think with food and our bodies, it's even worse because we live in a culture where dieting and hating your body is so normalized that it's so tricky to know when is it an issue. And so, there are definitely those phrases that people talk about of like, if it stops you from being able to live, laugh, love the way that you want to. But I think, again, that becomes tricky when you don't even believe you deserve those things. So the way I back it up more so is to say universally, we all have shame. So the fact that you have a belief in your body and your brain that says you are not deserving of love, connection, value, unless fill in the blank, says that you deserve to talk to somebody about it. Like that is hard enough. Even if an eating disorder or another addiction never came through the door, just being able to say out loud to someone, I feel like if I can't get straight A's, if I don't have this body size or whatever the case may be, my husband's going to leave me. I'm not going to get the job. So I think saying, rather than do I have this suffering, saying I have this suffering and switching it to a universal experience, because then it's not a gradation of, well, these people are better than me because they don't. And what does it say about me if I do? So you just say everybody has it. I have it because I'm a human. And so I think that flip is kind of step number one. And then step number two of thinking about, is there anything that might be offered or extended or enhanced if my life could be without some of these thoughts? So again, for me, a lot of it was, I didn't mind the behaviors. I didn't mind some of those things as much. What I hated and what was the driving thing I wanted to get rid of is I would spend hours in my head. I would go out with, friends or family, and I couldn't tell you anything they said. And that hurt. That went against my values. That went against who I wanted to be. And I wanted that time back in my head. I wanted to not be so afraid of being alone that every time that nobody was around, I was worried about what I was going to do or what I was going to think. And so I think it's finding the thing that you are fearful of so much that happens every day, and then saying, what would it look like if I could let that go or learn how to deal with it in a different way? And then again, going back to that, everybody has this, therefore there are tools to know how to work with it. So it's not that you're broken and unhelpable, it's that you just haven't been in a position to learn any of these things yet. So what does it look like to seek that out?
Yeah, excellent. And so I know that we're sort of running out of time here. So what advice would you give somebody with an eating disorder?
I think depending on obviously so I'm always very careful because, I know you've talked about this in different settings too, but depending on where somebody's at in their eating disorder recovery, cognitive rigidity gets way worse as somebody is not getting adequate and consistent nutrition. So it's really hard for somebody to take in information depending on how deep their eating disorder has kind of shifted their brain's power. So everything becomes much more about absolutes, much more about all or nothing.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think I tell clients all the time in the therapy room is that an eating disorder is one of the worst things to try to recover from, because what it is it's basically taking you away from doing things that you feel like is going to secure your place in the world
Yeah,
and you're
keeping you
never
safe and protecting you.
exactly, and enhancing your value for a lot of people, even depending on what their body size looks like, obviously, and like what their disorder is. It's either saying you're going to constantly hide your shameful behaviors, or you're going to engage in behaviors that amplify who you are. And so depending on what someone's eating disorder is, there's this sense of it's going to stay in a box and be protected, and then you're going to have these things, you're going to be okay in some way. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about recovery, particularly from anorexia and bulimia, what we're talking about is a lot of times going to move their body away from an ideal, or a lot of the times going to shift their body where they're going to be like, well, why do my friends get to diet and get to do these things? And they can go work out and they don't have to think about it. Like there's an unfairness in recovery because the rules are going to feel like they look different for you now. But the reality is the rules have been different for you for a long time because your brain's been telling you, you have to do this to be okay. You have to look this way. You have to do these things. You can't do these things. You're a piece of crap. So you have to go, if somebody maybe with binge eating disorder, that associates with every time they feel less than. So instead thinking, this is a really unfair point, and that recovery sucks in a lot of ways, but it's beautiful in so many other ways, because I think sometimes there's this painting of everything with sort of a toxic positivity, that it's going to be so wonderful and like everything's going to be great. And it is. As somebody living in recovery, I love my life way more now than when I was in my eating disorder. Yeah. It also sucks that I have to be considering all the time when I don't want to eat something, is it because of this? And when I'm like, fixating on my weight for a little bit, do I have to talk about it? Or when I'm catching myself, there's a different, I can't do things that other people can do. And I have to be much more clear about what those kind of yeses and nos are to keep myself safe and therefore the life that I live.
But I think over time, you, for me anyway,
yeah,
because it has been 25 years or so since I've been in recovered, it becomes much easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think 10 years in for me now is different than it was, 8 years ago or 5 years ago for sure. But I also think being aware of, when I had my daughter 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, that was a new point. I have a lot of clients that I work with that when I'm talking mostly specifically cisgender women in this moment, but like having a kid, going through menopause, these like, where another aspect of your identity is now called into question, is a lot of the times when those things can come back in full force. And so I think it's sort of a vigilance that has to exist at all points in time to know.
For me, that's very, very distant. I don't have to be vigilant, but that has sort of like is very far into the past now.
And that's, I think, such a fantastic piece to hear. I mean, as somebody who, like, you said, having that much time and knowing that that's possible. And I think knowing that is something that a lot of people can get to. And then also knowing for some people, if it isn't, it doesn't mean that recovery isn't still a beautiful place to exist. It just, it does sometimes, I think, come with like not wanting to paint it as rainbows and unicorns, but painting it with a degree of sort of a freedom from that constant point of feeling like you are, this.
Absolutely. And take it in steps and stages.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So Kyira, so how can people find you?
They can go to my website. So we can put the link below. It's adversityrising.com. You can find tons of materials, insights, pieces there to kind of get started in anything. Otherwise, if you're interested in reaching out directly under the connect section, you can email me, you can join my email list, whatever people want to do. If somebody's feeling like they want to talk more, especially going back to that idea of finding the right support for you, my suggestion is always somebody's website is great. Buying a book, buying a workbook, watching a video, those things are great. But if you have something specific for you, giving yourself the right and knowing you have a chance to reach out. So just email me, let me know. And yeah, having that connection and kind of figuring out how to support someone else is what I love to do.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, thank you so much, Kyira, for all your genuine and constructive advice here. It'll be super helpful for people.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for listening. So before you go now, and we go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple iTunes so you never miss an episode. And also let us know what you think by showing some love, your favorite podcast, by leaving a review on whatever channel you listen to on. So great. Well, thank you everybody for listening. And I look forward to speaking with you in the next episode.